Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started. It is 10:01. So it's great to see such a large room of people. Secretary of State Simon and I have traveled and met with county auditors throughout the state, and this is absolutely the number one topic on everyone's mind as we go out and meet with people. So for those of you who do not know me, my name is David Maeda. I'm the Director of Elections for the Secretary of State's office. I was appointed to the position in February, and prior to that, I spent 11 years as a Minnetonka City Clerk, and then 3 years prior to that as the Hennepin County Election Supervisor. So I've been involved with the elections most of my adult life and some of my childhood life. So what I think we'll do, because I know Miranda's here, and Miranda loves history, we'll give a little history about presidential primaries in our state. This is actually our fifth in our state's history. The first one, the 1913 legislature passed a law creating the first PNP in the state in 1916. And I think it's interesting to note that that law was repealed the year after. So I don't know what happened, but they got rid of the primary pretty quickly. And then same thing happened in 1949. The legislature passed a law establishing a presidential primary of 1952, and that law actually existed for two primaries, 52 and 56. And then again, that was repealed shortly after. And then I don't know if any of you were around in your jobs in 1992, but that was our last presidential primary. And that law was actually, we had the primary. It was a non-binding primary, so it's slightly different than what we're going to be doing next year, and I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. But the law remained on the books until basically 1999, but we did not have a primary in 1996 because in 1995 they kind of suspended things. So we do not have a long history of having presidential primaries in our state. For those of you who are a little bit political, you know that the parties had presidential preference polls at their caucuses, and that's generally the way that our voters have participated in selecting who's going to be the presidential nominee in the two major parties. So in 1918, the legislature passed the law creating our primary for 2020. This is what was in that original law. The primary is to be held on the first Tuesday in March 2020 unless the parties agreed to a different date. They did not submit any other alternatives, so it will be on the first Tuesday in March 2020. There is a requirement that the voter declare their political party preference, and this, of course, is vastly different than what we're used to dealing with, because as you realize now, when a voter registers to vote, they don't have to declare a party, and when they go to vote, they don't either. Unlike some states, they do have to do that. And then according to the 2018 law, the political party preference of the voter is going to be included in our public information list that our office provides, which anyone can get for $46. You can get a list of all the registered voters in the state and the way in the elections that they have voted in the voter history. So the political party was going to be included in that list. And then each of the party gets its own ballot. In 2018, you might recall we gained two major political parties, both having to deal with legalizing marijuana. So we could have up to 4 different ballots in our presidential primary. And then the law required the state to reimburse you for hopefully most of your costs that are incurred in the primary. Last year's legislature actually made some changes to the law. The first being the primary one, and Secretary Simon was very involved with this because he was very concerned about the privacy piece. The voter's political preference is now private data, except for it's available to the major party chairs. And the way the legislature did this, they put it under the Chapter 13, which is, for those of you who are your data practices or responsible authorities, known as the Data Practices Act. So it's classified as non-public under the Data Practices Act. And the reason I point that out is, as you know, anytime we ask for non-public data from people, we have to give them a tennyson warning explaining why we are asking for that data, how we're going to use that data, and what happens if they refuse to give that data. So technically, we do have to give a tennyson warning to all the voters before they vote. And we're going to do that we're creating a poster that you can display in your polling place. And if anyone has questions about why they're being asked, I'm sure we are going to get some questions about why they're being asked for their political party. One way would be to point them to the poster, but my preferred method would be to explain to them that each party has its own ballot, and in order to issue the voter the ballot that they want to vote on, we have to know their party. I think that goes more of a long way than just saying it. We're asking for your party because it's a law. I don't think that's going to go over very well. And then, yes, Amy.
Is your office going to be providing the script for cities to use when our judges or front desk staff get those kind of questions?
So Amy's question is, are we going to prepare some type of script that you can respond to that type of question? And actually, that's not come up, but we can certainly do that. We are, there's another issue that is going to take some explanation to voters that's different about the primary. And we do have a script for that. I'll explain that as we get to that in the presentation. The other change to the law was that only major parties with national conventions are allowed to participate in the PNP. So you might ask, how does this impact the two new marijuana-related parties? And basically, it doesn't define in statute what a national convention is. So if those two parties certify candidates to our office, we're going to assume they're having a national convention. Secretary Simon and I did meet with the four party chairs about a month ago to kind of make sure we are all on the same page. At that point in time, one of the two, and I should know their names, but I keep mixing them up. But one of the two clearly had a national candidate and had presence in, I think they said Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. So they do have some type of national presence. The other party, I don't think had even thought about this, and they indicated they didn't have a presidential candidate at that point. They do have until December 31st, the end of this year, to certify the candidates that will be appearing on their ballot. So we'll know for sure on December 31st, and we won't know before then. And then probably most importantly for those of you in this room, the legislature gave us more discretion on what we can reimburse you for. We noticed that in the original law, there were obvious things missing, and nobody in this room will care, but one of the things missing was the cost for mail ballot precincts in greater Minnesota. The cost of the postage wasn't covered under the original law. So things like that, we certainly need to reimburse people for. Our office, if you don't know, is currently doing rules, and we're soliciting comments, and those comments are due by October 4th. So if you think there's a reimbursable cost that we're not thinking about, please contact our office, and we'll think about that to include in the rules. I should mention as I go along, Amy asked a question. If any of you have any questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand. I'll be happy to answer your question as we go along. So here's some of the key dates for the PNP. As I mentioned, December 31st is the date that the parties will be certifying their names of the candidates that will be placed on their ballots. And then between January 3rd and March 2nd, election judges that serve in the PNP have to be given an additional hour of training. The absentee voting period begins January 17th, which is coming up quickly here. And then March 3rd is the presidential primary. And you have until May 9th to get us your expenses to be reimbursed, but that's the deadline. I'm hoping you get us, as soon as you can, work with your counties to get us your costs. We're actually going to have to hire someone to do this process, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but we're creating forms that you'll submit your expenses on, and then we'll explain further in detail on what documentation we need to reimburse you, but we're going to have a person really tracking this information.
David?
Yes?
Will the Secretary of State's office be offering online training for judges?
We will not. I know a lot of counties have online training, and I know I spoke to one county yesterday that's definitely going to do it, so I would encourage the counties to do that, but it's the counties that train election judges. I should back up too. Our county auditor training that we did was 2 weeks ago. We offered two different trainings. 86 out of the 87 counties attended. Most of the metro counties set their entire staff. But if you haven't really been in touch with your county about any of this, I'm assuming that they were waiting until they got trained before they reach out to you. So I'm sure that you'll be hearing more from your counties going forward here. So some things to keep in mind for the PNP. As you realize, it's March 3rd, 2020. March 3rd, we could have a blizzard. We don't typically have elections during the wintertime. So you want to make sure that any elections emergency plans you have in place, you make sure that those deal with things like blizzards. Or I was talking to someone from Excel yesterday, and we talked a little bit about what happens if the power goes out all day in a location. So you want to make sure and work with the counties to make sure that you're contemplating having an election in March, which is unusual. Typically, you have until December 31st to pass your resolution or ordinance establishing your polling places for the next year. For the PNP, the deadline to change your polling place is December 4th. So this year, you should really get your polling places in line by December 4th, because that's the last date you can change your PNP polling place, and you cannot use a polling place for the PNP and then change it for the primary in general unless there's some type of an emergency that allows you to do that. The data privacy issue, this is actually my biggest, one of my two biggest concerns. The first being mail balloting process, which again, none of you have to deal with, but the second being data privacy, because as I mentioned, it's under the Data Practices Act that this is classified as non-public information. So if I serve as an election judge and I go home and tell my wife, did you know Devin is a marijuana party member? I've now created a data breach, and that, as you know, has serious implications. So we want to really instill in our election judges the seriousness of which they have to take the data privacy issue. That said, when I mentioned this to the county auditors, we have to temper that because we don't want to scare people away. We don't want them thinking, I don't want to serve because I don't want to break laws. We have to make sure they understand the seriousness of the data privacy, but do it in a way that doesn't scare them. And the last item on this slide, I'm sure, have any of you heard about the Universal Postal Union? Good. This issue actually went away yesterday. It could have impacted our overseas and military voters. There was I won't get into it because it got resolved yesterday, but it would have impacted the way the postage was calculated for UOCAVA voters. But again, as I mentioned, that actually got resolved yesterday. So here are the four major parties in our state: the Legal Marijuana Now Party, the Grassroots Legalized Cannabis Party, the Republican Party, and the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. The law allows the parties to decide if they're going to allow write-in votes, and it also allows them to designate a slot for an uncommitted option. And this is what we'll talk about a little bit. When we met with the four-party chairs, the DFL chair indicated that their national party rules do not allow write-ins, but they require the uncommitted option. The Republican Party chair indicated they won't have either of those two, they'll just have candidates. And then the two other parties, I don't think had contemplated this, so I'm not sure what they will do. And again, they have until the end of December to decide this. But what uncommitted means, basically what the primary is the voters are helping the parties assign delegates to their national convention. And a party that allows an uncommitted option, they're saying, we want those delegates to remain uncommitted until the national convention. And to Amy's point about a script, we do have a script for what voters should be told about this. It's going to look a little odd because the uncommitted option gets rotated along with all the other candidate names. So there are going to be ballots where uncommitted is at the top and all the way through the rotation. So I'm assuming voters are going to have a question about that. And we want to be kind of careful about explaining this to them. Our advice is don't jump into that water unless the question is asked, because we don't want to be accused of influencing someone to pick that or not pick that. Similar to the property tax disclaimer that gets included on referendum questions, or the by not voting on this question, it equals a no vote on constitutional amendments. If a voter has a question, of course, election judges have to answer it, but don't be just explaining this to anyone that doesn't ask that question. We've gotten a lot of questions about how many ballots should be ordered, and the state law requires that you order at least 100 ballots for every 85 individuals who voted in the last similar election. As I mentioned, the last similar election was 1992, and we had a 10% turnout for that primary, but it was a completely different animal. It was non-binding, which on the Republican side, you had an incumbent president, and on the DFL side, it was non-binding. So I think that tapped down the turnout for that. We've kind of looked at what counties are doing as far as trying to determine the turnout, and it was Hennepin County that did the most research into this, and they're expecting a turnout similar to a gubernatorial election. So like 60% is typical for an election like that. But again, this is completely different. That's totally an educated guess, so it's very difficult to say for sure how many ballots should be ordered. The other thing I should mention is March 3rd is what's called Super Tuesday. So many states are having their primaries on that date. So it's likely there's going to be a lot of national media coverage on the states having a primary. So that might play into it. The online application will be published after the November election. So mid-November, voters will be able to apply online to get an absentee ballot for the primary. We're waiting for after the for those of you having a November election because we don't want the voter submitting the wrong application. The P&P application does require the voter to state their party preference so you know what ballot to issue to them. And so the online version will be published in mid-November. We actually have the paper version available on our webpage right now under the election administrator forms section of our webpage. We kind of encourage you not to widely distribute that at this point because the paper form has the online URL, and we don't want people going to online thinking they can apply for a P&P absentee at this point. And that's basically the major change in the form is the party preference, and that's what's highlighted there. We also have a Tennyson warning on the back of the form that explains why the political party is being asked for. We did convene a P&P working group that helped us do our election administrator manual, and that manual is actually available online on our website at this point. But one of the major things that we had a discussion about was there has to be a cutoff on when a person can change their mind, decide they want to switch from one party to the other party. For those who do mail-in absentee ballots, they have up until that 7th day when direct balloting starts. But if they change their party, they do have to submit a different application. You don't want to just cross out what they put on their original application because you want to track that they actually called you and said they wanted to make a change or contacted you and said they wanted to make a change. It becomes a little bit more difficult in the polling place when a voter changes their mind because what they're doing in the polling place is they're signing the roster, which indicates that they believe in this party's views, basically. And so it's a little hard to believe that somebody can change their political views within 2 minutes and then get a new ballot. So what we are encouraging is once that ballot has been issued to the voter, they cannot change their party. They can spoil a ballot and get another ballot of the same party, but they cannot change their mind on the major political party at that point. And I think the best way to explain this to voters is your grader judge has an extra duty this year. They really want to explain to the voter, look at the sample ballots, and you have to pick a political party, one of the up to 4 ballots. And once you make that choice, you cannot change your mind. Get them that information right away so they're thinking about that before they actually sign in. Did you have a question, Devin?
Can that be challenged in court? Yeah. You didn't let me, it's not in state law. Can you?
So the question is, if we do this, can we be challenged in court? Well, yeah. I mean, any decision we make can be challenged in court. I think one of the other things the P&P working group came up with is what do you do in a situation where you have one of your partisan election judges serving as one party and then they vote as a different party, and we're not going to police that because we've discussed this a little bit. It's plausible that for national elections, I vote for one party, but for local elections, I really serve as another party. So it is, I mean, people do strategically do different things, and we don't want to get into going down that road of challenging somebody's political party preference.
So this is if they sign the roster, then they can no longer change.
What we're saying is once they get the ballot in their hand, they can no longer change. I've heard, and I haven't spoken to, for those of you who use the e-poll book, the poll pads. I've heard that no ink's programming is not going to allow you to change the party once the voter has been processed. I have not confirmed that with them. So I mentioned each election judge that is serving in the PNP has to have an additional hour of training that occurs within 60 days of the PNP, and you should focus on what's different about the PNP. One of the questions about what's reimbursable is the question was asked if you have to do additional regular judge training because somebody is serving that wasn't trained in 2018. Is that reimbursable? And we're discussing that internally. I've kind of gone through this, but the voter's choice is the voter's choice. It's private and shouldn't be talked about within the polling place or outside the polling place. And again, at some point, the voter has to make up their mind on which party they're voting in. We're saying once they have the ballot in their hand, they can't change their mind.
I'm sorry, is that both ways, mail-in or in person?
So the question is, does that include mail-in absentees? And the mail-in absentees have up until the direct balloting period, 7 days before the election when you separate the ballot from the envelope. And I should touch on that a little bit. It currently is, if you're following, the Democrats have a lot of candidates. They're going to certify the candidates on their ballot to us on December 31st. Then the Iowa caucuses occur and the New Hampshire primary occurs. It's very likely that field will be narrowed down by the time we get to our PNP. So I expect that a lot of voters, you'll see a lot more voters wanting a second ballot, because if their candidate dropped out of the race, they're going to want to vote again. And they can do that under the law. They can get another absentee vote ballot. Some of the other things you want to consider, again, privacy is very important. So you're going to indicate on the voter receipt, the party that the voter chose, so the ballot judge knows what ballot to give to the voter. But you don't want it so they're stacking up the one party here, and you can see by the number of receipts which party the previous voter picked. You want to make sure that there's privacy all throughout the process, and that includes issuing the ballots. You want to kind of have the ballots discreetly placed so that you can't see you have a huge pile of Democrat ballots and a lower pile of Republicans. You just want to make sure privacy is considered in everything the election judges are doing. I mentioned the greeter judge would be a great person to kind of explain to the voter that there are up to four ballots that they have to make a choice from. That they're only going to get the one ballot of the one party, and then they can't change their mind once they're given the ballot. The roster judge, it's, again, very important that they maintain the privacy of the voter. We're looking, how many of you still use paper rosters? So those of you who use paper rosters, we were trying to figure out a good way, because we want to cover up all the party choices of everyone else who has signed in at that point. One of the counties indicated there's good Avery labels that can be easily stuck on and removed. We're looking at something more like a signature guide where it only shows the one line. But if any of you have good ideas about that, I'm all ears. It won't be an issue for the poll book. The way that No Ink is programming the poll book is the voter is going to select their party on one of the first screens. So that will be a little bit different in your process, and the voter is actually going to be touching the iPad. But again, that was done to help so the voter doesn't have to speak their choice to anybody. And we've talked about each voter has to indicate their political party preference. That becomes part of their voter record. And this is where the uncommitted option becomes very important, because we know at least one of the parties is going to have that option. I should have looked at our manual, but there is language in our manual that gives you suggested language to use that your election judges can use to explain what uncommitted means. Because I served 2 shifts at our state fair booth, wanting to hear what type of questions people had, and literally one person had heard of the PNP. And when you start talking about what the difference between what this is versus one of our regular elections, you get into the weeds really quickly and people's eyes gloss over. And uncommitted is something that, unless you're really paying attention to what the political party process is, you're not going to know that. We talked about the voter receipt. Make sure that the voter standing behind me can't determine how I voted by the pile of receipts that it gets stuck in. We've talked about the replacement ballot. So as far as tracking the number of ballots that you're sending to each polling place, nothing changes in that. You have to keep track of the total number of ballots that you're sending to the polling place. You don't have to indicate how many ballots of each party you're supplying. Your head election judges are going to have an interesting day because they are going to be dealing with voters who are not happy that they have to disclose their political parties. So the head election judge should be trained on how subtly to explain that, and Amy will try to come up with some language that they can use. The more challenging thing, I think, will be for your healthcare facility judges, because that adds I can't imagine doing that process in one of the nursing homes, because it's going to be tricky explaining to somebody why they're disclosing their party for the first time in their life and then trying to keep that private from other people. Challengers, it's important to note that a challenger cannot challenge a voter's party choice. That's up to the voter to decide. So even if I know Devin belongs to a marijuana party and he votes Republican, I can't challenge that. And then our current law prohibits anybody from making a list of voters, and that we emphasize here as well. Complaints, this is not a HAVA-related complaint. HAVA deals with voter registration and voting equipment issues. That falls outside of HAVA, so your county should be supplying you with the state election complaint form. This is a sample of how the paper roster will look. You can see, and I should mention that it's already been programmed to include all 4 parties, and that's not changeable at this point. So even if only 3 parties participate, all 4 are going to show up on the roster and on our absentee application and in any material at this point. This is the screen in SVRS that shows you the 4 parties. You have to pick that. If you don't pick a party when you're processing an application, you will get an error message.
Is it gonna be a big error message or the little tiny thing on top?
It will be one of the tiny things on top. So there's no one more gung-ho in getting SVRS changed than I was when I was at Minnetonka. I thought this is a database. This should be easily changeable. It should be much more functional. I now am wearing a different hat, and they told me when they added the direct balloting functionality in 2018, it nearly took the entire system completely down. And so any major changes to the system at this point, we're risking the stability of the system. So we are really focusing on stabilizing the system first and then making changes in the future. Yes, Christina.
So David, if one of the marijuana parties decides not to field a candidate for this, or candidates for this, then will that choice still be on the application forms, or at that point after December 31st, will we remove it? And what do we do if we get an application that has a party that's not a ballot?
So Christina's question is, if one of the 4 parties, it could be any of the 4 parties, decides not to field any of a candidate, will our absentee application still have all 4 parties? And the answer is yes, because it's in our rules at this point. But it is a good question. What do you do? And there might be confusion because, as I mentioned, I can't even remember the different names of the 2 marijuana parties, that voters might confuse one of the marijuana parties with the other marijuana party, and they get the ballot and said, this isn't the ballot I want. In the polling place, that, as we mentioned, that becomes problematic. It should be caught before then. But for absentees, you can reissue the other party's ballot. The problem becomes, and this doesn't apply to absentees, but in our mail ballot precincts, they have to actually write the name of the party on their envelope. And if somebody writes weed party, how do you interpret that? And so we've trained the counties on how to deal with that. This label shows you where the political party is on the label, and it's just the first letter of the party name. So this is the Grassroots Legalized Cannabis Party. And then this shows you an SVRS, the party, where the party preference will be recorded. The only thing I'll note about this is for those of you who have other staff that help you with absentee voting or bring in election judges, this is similar to the birth date and the driver's license and social security information. That's all in the voter record, but it is private information. So you want to make sure that the other staff and your election judges helping you that use SVRS understand that that is private information. So the major reason we decided to meet with the 4 party chairs is the question, could there be a recount after the PNP? And if you look at the way the statutes are written, Chapter 207A is a statute that created the PNP, and there's a subdivision within that statute that says anything that's not covered in this statute, you're supposed to administer the election the same way you would do a state primary. And as you know, in state primaries, we can have recounts. But again, this is a little different animal. We're not actually choosing a candidate to go on the ballot. We're choosing the way the parties are going to split up their delegates. And so we actually met with the 4 party chairs, and it was, again, the DFL said their national party rules don't allow for recounts. The Republicans didn't seem to think it was going to be an issue in their party. And then it was clear the 2 marijuana parties had not even contemplated this. So we went to the AG's office and asked for an opinion. And the AG opined that, and this was before this slide was created, we just got the opinion back and they said our statutes do not allow a recount or a contest for the PNP. So that's good news. We won't be recounting ballots. Again, access to the political party preference is private, except we have to provide that to the chair of each major political party. If you've been following the news, one of the parties is disagreeing with our reading of that statute and think that each of the parties should only get their own voters' information. And it's conceivable we'll see a lawsuit in that dispute because that party clearly believes that we should not be giving their voters' data to the other parties. And then we talked about covering up the party preference on the paper rosters. Yes.
So when our election judges and the voter come in and they say, well, my party information private, we know the answer to that. But then when they say, well, what do the parties do with it? Or what are they allowed to do with it? Then what's the proper response to that?
Christina's question is, what is the proper response to somebody that says, well, what can the parties do with my data? I'm paraphrasing. But that's kind of in dispute too. I think this is a very unique situation where we are providing private data to a private entity. Clearly, if I give you access to SVRS, you cannot reveal anything that's non-public data because you're covered under the Data Practices Act. But private entities really are not. So we've been asked that question, and it's unclear. Well, it's clear they can only use it for what voter data can be used for, which is election, campaign, or law enforcement purposes. But beyond that, they're obviously going to use the information to contact voters. And I think under the campaign exception in the law, that's allowable. So I listed, and it might be small on your slides here, what in the original reimbursable costs was what I listed up until the last bullet there with the 2019 law change. And so that's really the only things we could have reimbursed you for. And then in 2019, the law gave us a really broad discretion. It said our office can reimburse you for other things and left it at that. And so we are doing some rulemaking. And again, I mentioned October 4th is the last day public comment ends. So you want to consider things that we might not be considering at this point to make sure that you're fully covered. The legislature and the lawmakers I talked to clearly were sincere in wanting to reimburse you your cost of your elections, other than your heartache of doing this. And for you that are salary employees, you're not going to be reimbursed. But I mean, they don't want you holding the bag for party political activity. So they really do want to make you as whole as possible. And that kind of ends my P&P stuff. I'm ending all my trainings or presentations with, so 80% of my job since I've started in February has been devoted to thinking about the P&P. The other 80% has been cybersecurity. The other 80% has been figuring out how best to use my staff, figure out what their talents are and kind of figure out my staff. And so I'm ending all my presentations with information about cybersecurity because it's very, very important is if you're paying any attention to what's going on, not only actual attacks to computer systems or voting systems or computers, but also because there's growing concern about that and it causes people to question the integrity of our elections. And so we really have to be careful about doing what we can to reduce the risk to attacks to our system so the public has confidence that the election is as it should be. And so if, how many of you belong to the EISAC? Do you know? It's more of an IT thing, but it's free resources and materials from the Department of Homeland Security that's available to any government entity. So if your city, I'm guessing most of the larger cities are already signed up for this. We have found out like all the counties have signed up for this. But if your city is not, you want to make sure that you look into that or your IT folks look into that because they do provide free resources. And these slides CISA is part of the Department of Homeland Security. And they're the ones, they actually do have a local representative. If you want information about this, I can put you in touch with that person. Yes, Chris?
Could you repeat that again so we can keep it back to our cities?
It's E/ISAC, and that stands for something. The E is elections. And I will mention one, so any of you that followed the last legislative session know we were the last state in the country to get access to the federal HAVA funds that were made available by the Congress in 2018. We finally got access to that late in the session last year. One of the things we're going to use those funds for is what's called a cyber navigator. And what that is it's a staff person that will be under the elections purview of the office that will be a resource for counties and cities and townships throughout the state. They can come out and visit your site and give you suggestions on things that will improve the security, primarily the cybersecurity of your systems. And that person hopefully will be starting. I actually talked to one of the candidates yesterday, wanted a pre-interview, so I talked to her. And we are closing the bottom line, that person should be starting within hopefully a month from now, and we'll make sure that you are aware of who that person is and they might be reaching out to you, but they can explain a lot of what's in these slides. And I think with that, my presentation is finished, but I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has. It's interesting as primarily the counties I visited as Secretary Simon are ones with new county auditors who haven't run elections, and the anxiety of them is low. But when we meet with somebody that's administered 20 years worth of elections, their anxiety seems to be higher because I think the new people don't know what they don't know, so they're not so worried about it. Well, thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Do you have a separate election judge workbook for the PNP?
So the question is, are we creating a separate P&P election judge guide? It's not going to be a separate guide, but it's going to be a supplemental guide to the other guide because we didn't want to create something that might be only used one time. But that actually I was hoping to have available today. We're not quite finished.
And that will be available on your website then?
Yes.
Okay.
As a previous city clerk, was one piece of advice you have for us to get through this?
So Miranda's question is, the previous city clerk, what one piece of advice do I have to get you through this? I'm going to use what Secretary Simon has been telling the county auditors. We have very good elections people throughout the state of Minnesota. We know how to do these things. We focused on what primarily are the differences here, but 90% of what you're doing is going to be the same as you've always been doing. So I think getting over the piece that is new, I mean, I'm not just saying ignore it, but it's not that huge a deal. That's my advice. Okay, yes.
You talked about the scripts a couple times during your presentation. I think those are so important, so the state, everybody's given the same message to voters, because that public trust thing is a big deal, and I think if we're all on the same page with what we're telling voters consistently, that's important to being successful.
So if you didn't hear Amy, she believes, and I concur, that it's very important we are delivering the consistent messages throughout the state. And I have at this point been contacted by 5 out of the 6 Mcfoa regions. So I'm going to be speaking to all throughout the state. I'm still in negotiations with the 6th, but we hope to hit all parts of the state. Yes.
I have one question for the election judges. Since this election is in March, I'm assuming we're going to still have to meet the party balance requirements as we do in other elections, and that could, at least for our city, that could be difficult because a lot of our election judges are snowbirds.
So if you didn't hear the comment, it's about, do you have to have party balance for the PNP? And the answer is yes, you do have to have party balance. The good news is you now have 4 parties you can choose from. I don't know if you're going to get a lot from the other 2 parties, but yes, party balance is required. And one of the things I've learned going different counties is it's pretty standard practice just to have one judge from each 2 different parties, and then have the rest serve as unaffiliated, which is, I know some cities in the metro region do that, but that I've learned it's more commonplace than I knew it was. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Real quick before everyone,